So,
well, let me say a few words then, Stevens. First of all, it's a real pleasure to join you this evening. And really by chance, it was mentioned to me that this was happening, so I very much felt I should. I think as somebody who's only recently learned Albanian, one of the things that struck me is how for many of us in the United Kingdom, we really don't know very much about Albanian culture at all. But once you start learning the language, and obviously once you're here, there's a whole culture that opens up to you. And whether that's through the literature, whether that's through poetry, as you know, been involved in the previous event we did on poetry. But obviously, when you're here in Kosovo as well, there are lots of questions about the difference between Gegerisht and Tosk and how that's come about and what it really means. And so I'm very much looking forward to listening to Dr. Elliott speak this evening. And I'm sure it will be very helpful for me in understanding better the place that I am and the people that I'm with. So thank you very much. And I look forward to listening.
So it's over to Justin, I think.
Thank you very much. Just to say, as an introductory, the screen that you see in front of you has the slogan of the national football team of Albania. Oh, how good it is to be that I'm Albanian. And that is in Geg on the left and in Tosk and the standard language on the right. This is primarily a historical paper about how the place of language and national identity in Kosovo. So in April 1968, historian Ali Hadri, Historian Ali Hadri attended a large meeting of intellectuals to discuss the form of the Albanian language in Yugoslavia, called the Linguistic Consultation of Pristina. There he delivered a speech greeted with thunderous applause that set the tone of the meeting and came to typify not just the linguistic, but also the social and political mood of the time. Hadri said that the Albanians had had a long and tragic history of oppression, and that those in Yugoslavia had been separated from the social and cultural development of their motherland. The Albanians in Yugoslavia were not a minority, but a majority in the areas where they lived, separated from Albania. Given the rapid political, economic, social, and cultural change Albanian society in Kosovo was undergoing, he said, it was imperative that the intellectuals attending the meeting immediately adopted the draft standard language of the motherland, that is, Albania. Një kom, një gjuhë letrare. One nation, one literary language should be their watchword. Well, what was a historian doing at a conference discussing the form the literary language should take? Why did those at the meeting in Yugoslavia decide to adopt a form of Albanian quite different from their own, which had been created for the domestic purposes of another country? And given that both Albania and Yugoslavia were communist countries, weren't such countries supposed to create literary languages for their own citizens using local speech forms? Why discard over 15 years of their own work and adopt rules for Albanian written in Tirana? The forms of Albanian used in Albania and Yugoslavia were mutually comprehensible, but, as the great writer Fait Konica said, in writing they could be considered as different as Spanish and Italian. The two dialects, Geg in the north and Tosk in the south, are traditionally considered to be separated by the river Shkumbi, with a small transitional area in Muzece. About half the population of Albania speaks Tosk and half Geg, while in the former Yugoslavia, almost all Albanians are speakers of Geg. You'll notice from the map that there are only a small number of speakers of Tosk in the former Yugoslavia, gathered around Lake Prespa in Macedonia. The main features of the two dialects are quite different. Notably that Geg has vowels that vary according to length and nasality, unlike in Tosk. And the Tosk uses the subjunctive, whereas Geg has an infinitive, and that the forms of the future and imperfect are rather different, and as well as there being considerable differences in vocabulary. So in order to understand what it was that people at the Pristina linguistic consultation were agreeing to, we need to understand the development of the standard language in Albania in the years after 1945, the standard language that those in Pristina agreed to adopt. Standard Albanian was a product of Marxist-Leninist thinking, closely linked to Soviet linguistics, reflecting the Albanian state's values as part of a wider establishment of cultural policy fit for a new socialist society. While it was adopted in Yugoslavia, it is crucial to understand that the creation of the standard language and the arguments for the form it took were entirely local to Albania. At our last meeting, we heard about the importance of Constantin Christoforidis' translations of the Bible into Italian and to Albanian to the standardization of the language. This was because the translations were used during the First World War by the Shkodra Literary Commission, who were brought together by Austria-Hungary to help standardize Albanian. The commission favored the dialect of Elbasan, a southern form of Geg, as being a suitable bridge between the written forms of Geg and Tosk. The Elbasan dialect was approved for use in schools by the Congress of Lushnja in 1920 and entered into official use in Albania after 1923. However, because of the difficult political situation, the lack of trained linguists, the government's tolerance for those who wrote in whatever dialect that pleased them, and a wide spectrum of views on which dialect to choose as a basis for standardization, there was no standard Albanian language by 1945. At the end of the Second World War, the victorious Communist Party of Albania had very different views from the pre-war government and was much less tolerant of dissent. The communist strongholds were in the south of the country, from which they overcame nationalist and local forces in the center and particularly in the north. The Communist Party saw itself as the harbinger of a new society, sweeping away the vestiges of the old. What this meant in practice in the immediate post-war period was the purging of much of the northern intelligentsia centered around the Catholic Church. Much Geg literature, strongly associated with conservative Catholic writers in northwest Albania, was banned, and school books in the dialect were withdrawn. The Albania of the future in communist eyes was spoken by party activists, National Liberation Army soldiers, and collective farmers from the south. The most progressive part of the country, as they saw it, ranged against what communists saw as Catholic reactionaries and semi-feudal tribesmen in the north. Two meetings were held in Tirana to decide the base dialect for the standard language in 1952. While they were inconclusive, Dimitar Shucharici, the head of the Union of Artists and Writers of Albania, had party approval when he argued that the two dialects had been converging since the 19th century, with most publications since then being in Tosk, in the south, where most schools and progressive elements of society were to be found. In effect, he said, the literary language as effectively already was Tosk. There were good practical and ideological reasons for Albanian authorities to choose Tosk. Not only did most of the Albanian leaders come from the south, but Tosk was less diverse as a written dialect and thus easier to standardize. Furthermore, its style evident since the nationalist writings of the 19th century, was closer to the language spoken by ordinary people than the more arcane style of literary geg. Tosk could therefore be identified with a united, patriotic, progressive tradition close to the people and relatively free of religion, all of which fit in with the ideals of the party. While Tosk had been chosen as a base dialect for standardization, there remained much work to be done, such as producing grammars, dictionaries, rules for orthography, to create a modern standard language. And while all kinds of regimes do and undo language planning, the People's Republic of Albania operated with a clear ideological perspective in taking a firm hand with language standardization. Language planning was integral to the ideology of socialist construction. The nation, as Lenin had explained, was essentially bound by a common language as opposed to a common culture or fate, and it was through language, as what he said was the most important means of human intercourse, that the economic development of national movements was possible. Although identified with neither the Marxist concepts of base or superstructure, the theory was that the development of language was intimately linked to the political and social development of the nation. As capitalism triumphed over feudalism, Marxists thought, the bourgeoisie sought to unite national markets across feudal political boundaries, overcoming any obstacles to developing the language and consolidating its literature. Capitalism was characterized by the hegemony of the towns over the countryside. In linguistic terms, this meant peasants would abandon their territorial dialects for urban argot, with a closer relationship to the standard language of the hegemonic dominant class. With the decisive triumph of socialism, the proletariat would gain power for itself, and as the standard language was now the language of the ruling class, Soviet linguists argued it was in the interests of the party and the proletariat to minimize linguistic variation, particularly dialects, as remnants of the feudal epoch. The standard language was therefore the language of the proletariat and of the party. It was a language of struggle and opportunity, opening the possibilities up to all of full political, economic, and cultural participation, national in form, socialist in content, and eliminating backwardness and difference through mass literacy campaigns, bringing political education and an understanding of Marxism to the masses. Where there was no pre-existing standard language, as in Albania, it would be based on what was called the living popular spoken language. Depending on which dialect speakers were preponderant, on whether they occupied a dominant position in the economic, social, political, and cultural life of the nation, and on features of the phonetic system. In Marxist-Leninist eyes, what happened with language was an inextricable part of the social, political, and economic life of the nation. As such, language was not just a major battleground of struggle, but an instrumental instrument of socialist development. By the mid-1950s, the party was impatient for progress and reorganized the body responsible for implementing the unification of the literary language under the management of Androkli Kostalari, a Soviet-trained linguist. Kostalari said that the period after the reorganization had shown the rapid convergence of the dialects into a unified literary language, as differences between town and countryside, mental labor and physical labor had been abolished, a fact reflected and promoted by linguistic unity. Socialist development meant that contradictions both in society and language had been surpassed, and so further development of the language was no longer a matter of one dialect or another, but of a new standardized language that was in the process of replacing northern and southern modes of speech. And Here we can see Kostolari's view which he put into diagrammatic form. The shaded area here is the standard language, and in the two circles are the northern and southern dialect. You will notice the circle on the left, the northern dialect. Some of the circle is within the standard area. Those would be the features such as particularly vocabulary that were kept. But most of the northern dialect was left outside the standard language. With the southern dialect on the other circle on the right, most of the vocabulary and grammatical features would be kept, but some again would be left outside. The areas within the shaded circle outside the area of the two circles are areas such as vocabulary, expressions, where the standard language would gain elements that belonged neither to northern nor southern dialects as it progressed, and the areas in white in the dialect circles were areas which would eventually fade away, leaving just the single standard language as the language for everybody. This standard language, Kostolari argued, was historically created along a path of uninterrupted progress by the objective laws of development of Albanian society, and it was a matter of pride that by the end of the 1960s, language was at such a point of convergence that over 95% of all works published in Albania were in the standard language. Kostolari did not mention, of course, that publishing was a monopoly in communist Albania. However, the culmination of Kostolari's work was overseeing the new spelling rules of 1967. These rules were based on the northern form of Tosk, which, for the first time in official publications, allowed no alternative spellings closer to Geger. It was these rules that were approved without amendment at the linguistic consultation of Pristina in 1968. The development of the standard language in Albania then was a product of political choice, an instrument and a reflection of the desire of the party to remold the society in the People's Republic of Albania in a short space of time on the basis of Marxist-Leninist thought. However, in order to understand why the Tirana rules for a standard language were adopted in Yugoslavia, we need to get to the point where we understand thinking among Yugoslav Albanians about language and identity at that time. The answers to these questions have little to do with linguistics and much more to do with political, social, and cultural changes in Albanian society in Yugoslavia since 1945. Chief among those changes was the development of national identity as Albanians separated from Albania. What significance did this have for the Albanian language in Kosovo? It was not just a shortage of linguists in Kosovo that led to discussions about language being taken by historians, such as Ali Hadri. Discussion of language was a central part of a wider debate about the relative status of different ethnic groups in a multilingual society like Yugoslavia. What united those Albanians discussing the Albanian language is that they were those same people who were seeking political change by mobilizing Albanian national feeling, intellectuals. In order to understand what was going on at the Pristina linguistic consultation, we need to know something of the background of Albanian intellectuals in Kosovo and the society from which they came. Albanian society in Kosovo had been deeply traditional and in the great majority illiterate. Kosovo had also been very conservative. Some of the most important demonstrations against the introduction of the Latin alphabet in the early 20th century had taken place in that part of the world. The traditional elite of non-Slav society in Kosovo were landowners and clergy who defended local interests against Serb and Montenegrin encroachment and increasing centralization until 1941. The Second World War was to bring major changes to Kosovo, opening up the possibility of change in language and society. Before the war, the use of the Albanian language in education in Yugoslavia was forbidden. Most parents kept their children from school, fearing their children's assimilation as Orthodox Slavs. As a result, Albanian enrollment in the Yugoslav state system was very small, and a number of children who were Albanian fled across the border to seek an education in Albania. After the destruction of Yugoslavia in 1941, however, much of the Albanian lands were incorporated into the fascist-controlled state of Albania, whose borders we see illustrated here, which sent nationalist intellectuals acting as teachers and administrators to Kosovo. These intellectuals from Albania, many of whom had been born in Kosovo, encouraged parents to send their children to school, where they would be educated to venerate the national symbols of Albania, which had been delivered the non-Slav population from colonial Yugoslav rule. The end of the Second World War brought the position of intellectuals, and thus of identity formation, to the fore. The victorious communists re-established Yugoslav rule and engaged on a program of mass education in Albanian to create socialist citizens capable of bringing about industrialization while fighting what the partisans considered to be backward practices such as religion and customary law. The largely Serb and Montenegrin communist authorities persecuted and destroyed the power of the Muslim and Catholic clergy and landowning elite, as well as many of the wartime administrators and teachers. Although many Albanians had fought against the partisans, they were considered to be backward and untrustworthy. At the same time, they were members of a national minority, and therefore, in the eyes of the Yugoslav communists, they had certain rights. In order to bring about the transformation that they wanted, the communists had to work with members of local Albanian society they did not consider to be class enemies. In effect, politically acceptable teachers inherited from wartime, and the large number of young people who were put through short teacher training courses. Most Albanian intellectuals in Yugoslavia in the aftermath of World War II were thus primary school teachers, and it was to these teachers and other intellectuals that the party reached out as authority figures. Yet, because ordinary people saw their authority as independent of Serbian rule and predating communism, they saw these intellectuals as trustworthy, as they used their national identity as Albanians to protect their customs and culture from the prospect of Slav assimilation. The position of Yugoslav Albanians became more precarious with the expulsion of Yugoslavia from the Soviet bloc in 1948 over the Cominform resolution, especially as Albania remained a loyal ally of the Soviet Union. The border with Albania was closed. For Kosovo Albanians, this meant losing the teachers who had been sent from Albania, while textbooks imported from Albania were destroyed. In more personal terms, it meant that contact across the border was forbidden, and families were divided for decades thereafter. Albanians were under suspicion of disloyalty from the authorities as never before. For example, the police identified and followed subscribers to the main Albanian language newspaper, Ilindia. Songs which were performed on Radio Tirana were banned, and in what became known as the Prizren trial, relatives of leading Albanian members of the party were tried for subversion as agents of Albania. All in all, Yugoslav policy after 1948 revived feelings of persecution that among Albanians that had been experienced before the Second World War, and stoked grievances that were perceived in ethnic terms. Albanian ethnicity was seen by Serb and Montenegrin authorities as a sign of untrustworthiness, with teachers of Albanian language and history coming under particular suspicion. When it came to language, however, the difference between the Yugoslav authorities' declared intent and practice was stark. Although the party had enshrined full equality of languages in Kosovo as its guiding principle in all spheres of life in 1945, by 1950, examples of bilingual administration in the state sector had virtually disappeared. State administration was carried out through a favored language, that is Serbo-Croat, and where required, and often not even then, a translation in a supplementary language, usually Albanian, would be issued. Contrary to directives stipulating that a written request had to be answered in a language in which it was written, by 1965, only 10% of official documents were issued in Albanian, regardless of the language in which requests were made, which, considering that at least 2/3 of the population at the time were Albanian, leaves quite a considerable gap. One of the linguistic elements that rankled most with Albanians in Yugoslavia was the official designation in Serbo-Croat of the Albanians of Yugoslavia as Shqiptari, to be distinguished from the Albanci of Albania. The Yugoslav constitution viewed Croats, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Serbs, and Slovenes as people, and later Muslims, as people constituting the Yugoslav Federation with the right to their own federal republic. Albanians and other ethnic minorities were denied this right by the Yugoslav state on the grounds that they had a homeland outside Yugoslavia. On the other hand, by designating the Albanians of Yugoslavia as Shqiptari, and the Albanians were the only people in Yugoslavia to be treated this way, the Albanians were not even accorded the status of a foreign people. The reason for this imposition was territorial, being designed to justify the separation caused by the border in terms other than brute force. The Yugoslav Albanians' rejection of the label of Shqiptar was a repudiation of their suppression and rule from outside. Almost without exception, Kosovo Albanian linguists argue that there was an attempt to impose a language of the Shqiptari, Shqiptarski jezik, on the Albanians of Yugoslavia to differentiate them from Albanians in Albania, and thereby separating Shqiptars from Albanci as two distinct peoples. The attempts by Yugoslav Albanians in the 1950s and 60s to form a literary language based on the speech of Elbasan have been criticized by modern commentators in Kosovo as the state-run formation and implementation of the Shqiptar language. Much has been made of the need in the 1960s for Kosovo Albanian intellectuals to have avoided what is called the Macedonian Syndrome, whereby a new language and people distinct from Bulgaria was created within Yugoslavia. However, Yugoslavia took great care to create a literary language for Macedonian based on local speech forms, as the Macedonians were a constituent people of the country and imagined as essentially Yugoslav. However, Yugoslavia made no such efforts with the languages of ethnic minorities who were not the constituent peoples, although they had some autonomous rights. In the case of Albanian, there is no evidence of any attempt to follow the standardization of Macedonian. While the name Shqiptarski jezik, the Shqiptar language, existed in Serbo-Croat, it didn't exist in Albanian, the language being described as the written language of the Albanians of Yugoslavia. Unlike Macedonian, there was no attempt to give Albanian a Cyrillic alphabet or an alphabet closer to Slav languages than the one agreed in 1908. among all Albanians. There was no attempt to ensure the wholesale importation of terminology from Serbo-Croat, or either directly or in some Albanianized form. Kosovo Albanian writers of the time, in fact, frequently discussed the dangers of lexical, grammatical, and other linguistic contamination from Serbo-Croatian. The guidelines produced by Kosovo Albanian intellectuals in 1952, 1957, and 1964 were recommendations, and while deviations from them were criticized, they were not compulsory. Furthermore, the linguistic meetings that produced those recommendations were not overseen by a well-defined body showing strong interest in enforcing decisions and punishing those that breached them. Finally, the attempt to construct a literary language in Yugoslavia remained relatively close to the literary language introduced in Yugoslavia, the Albanian literary language introduced in Yugoslavia in 1941. The official Albanian of the time was still close to the dialect of Elbasan in Albania. There was no attempt to follow a Macedonian by basing the language on dialects spoken inside Yugoslavia. Although the literary language of the Albanians of Yugoslavia remains relatively close to the dialect of Elbasan, there were some attempts in the 1950s and 60s to push towards convergence with developments in standardization in Albania. But those only took off after the fall of the minister responsible for the secret police in Yugoslavia and Tito's deputy, Aleksandar Ranković, in 1966. Rankovic's fall created a new climate throughout Yugoslavia in which it was easier to express national feelings. In Kosovo, a new group of politicians came to the fore who openly acknowledged the persecution of Albanian intellectuals and admitted that Albanian national rights had taken second place to those of Serbs and Montenegrins. This was a situation they intended to rectify. As a result, Albanians felt much more ease in expressing Albanian national culture and national feeling than ever before. By the end of 1967, the politicians now in charge of Kosovo were saying that despite the two countries' ideological differences, Yugoslavia needed to normalize relations with Albania. This was manifested in the participation of scholars from Kosovo at the conference in Tirana, marking the 500th anniversary of the death of Skanderbeg, with scholars from Albania participating in a similar conference in Pristina and that May. Other signs of change were the republication of classic and contemporary works from Albania by the Rilindia Press, and the official history of Albania being published in Yugoslavia, with a short supplement about Kosovo from 1912 to 1945 by none other than the historian Ali Hadri. This was characteristic of the whole relationship between Kosovo and Albania. Kosovo Albanians, both intellectuals and the general public, had a sense of inferiority to Albania and a romanticized vision of it. Those who were able to travel to Albania and found it worse than expected often preferred not to reveal the truth about Hodges Albania when they returned home, for fear of being seen as collaborators of the Yugoslav authorities. So keen were Kosovo Albanians to follow where Tirana led that from the fall of Ranković in 1966 to the Pristina linguistic consultation 2 years later, articles appeared by Kosovo Albanian intellectuals decrying features of their own speech that departed from the Tirana standard, such as the Geger infinitive, described as a useless appendage left over from a phase of communicative primitivity, because, unlike the subjunctive, it does not specify person, number, and tense. This new atmosphere of relative freedom then generated a shift in which language increased its status as an emotive symbol of identity. It also produced similarly emotive changes with other symbols of identity. Kosovo Albanians were granted the right to use their own flag, which was identical to the flag of Albania, and other national emblems, all of which had been forbidden since 1946. The name of the province itself was changed to Kosovo from Kosovo and Metohia, the latter name referring to Orthodox Church land holdings, and it would no longer be subordinate to the Republic of Serbia, but have its own direct representation as part of the federation. There was a campaign against the use in Serbo-Croatian of that word Shqiptar, denoting Albanians in Yugoslavia only, and replacing it as an ethnic marker with the word Albanac, meaning all Albanians wherever they lived. The difference between Shqiptar and Albanac was political rather than linguistic. Serbian experts, as well as Albanians, had never claimed that there was any fundamental difference in the Albanian spoken on either side of the border. The abandoning of this distinction was reflected in the view of the new president of the People's Assembly of Kosovo, Fadil Hoxha, that Kosovo Albanians were not a minority in a foreign country, but in their own home, in lands settled by Albanians. These changes were accompanied by a commitment to enforce the provision for the equality of languages in public administration, with the hiring of staff in courts and municipal offices who spoke both languages. It was not just in government that Albanian was increasingly used, but it was becoming the first language of daily life in shops, offices, bus stations, doctors' surgeries. Slavs reported being refused service if they could not or would not speak Albanian, and feeling slighted when Albanians who knew Serbo-Croat insisted on translation. In the April of 1968, as I said, students packed gallery at the Pristina Linguistic Consultation. This meeting was not under the patronage of a state body, like previous meetings on language had been, but of institutions predominantly run by Albanians, the Albanological Institution of Pristina and the Department of Albanian Language and Literature at the Philosophy Faculty in Pristina. The professor of Albanian at the Philosophy Faculty, Idris Ajeti, gave the keynote address, saying there was nothing standing in the way of complete unification with Tirana's rules of 1967, except for three fundamental differences. From the first speech by Fehmi Agani, the director of the Albanological Institute, it was clear that such obstacles were not going to be allowed to stand. While it was acknowledged that there would be difficulties in implementation, these would surely be overcome with the goodwill of intellectuals, writers, teachers, journalists, students. Any kind of reservation, however indirect, was greeted with hostility, and those who demurred kept their counsel. This atmosphere was strikingly different to previous meetings on language. While the conclusions of those meetings had been recommendations which many had ignored, it was clear that even though the conclusions of this meeting were again to be presented as recommendations, failing to adopt the Tirana rules would not be tolerated. Moreover, while the conclusions of previous meetings had been sent to state and cultural bodies in Kosovo and Serbia, and the meeting in 1952 had even sent a celebratory letter to Tito, the Pristina Linguistic Consultation sent a letter with their conclusions to the State University of Tirana and the Institute of History and Linguistics in Albania, making clear the primacy of the link between Albanians as opposed to Albanians' place in Yugoslavia. However, thanks to the relatively light touch of Yugoslav language regulation, which we saw in comparison with Macedonian earlier, the years of debate that had led to this decision had been held entirely in Albanian, beyond the ken and beyond the care of Serbs and Montenegrins, who were much more exercised by symbols such as the flag, that they felt better encapsulated their worries over the change in relative status of national groups in Kosovo. The Kosovo Albanian intelligentsia had seized their opportunity, almost as soon as the political wind had changed in their favor. The decision to adopt the Tirana rules created for the purposes of the People's Republic of Albania were the first tangible sign of unity of all Albanians. The Stalinist ideological base of the Tirana rules was of no importance compared to the national prize that adopting this form offered. It was symbolic of the fact that an irreversible commitment to an Albanian nationality common with the people of Albania had been made. To this extent, Ali Hadri's point that the distance between Kosovo-Albanian speech and the rules of Tirana was of little importance was correct. Indeed, the further the Tirana rules were from Kosovo-Albanian speech, the more they marked the language out as a symbol of pan-Albanian identity, securing the goal of national Albanian unity while underlining the rejection of anything, such as the label of Shqiptar, that might divide Albanians in Yugoslavia from those in Albania. Language was a permanent reminder that the Albanians were not a minority within Yugoslavia, but rather to be identified with all Albanians, wherever they lived, their standardized language being evidence of a developed civilization with common literature, history, and cultural values equal to any other in Europe. And just to give you a little taste, this is a passage, an identical passage from the very same novel, one edition from 1960 before the changes and one from 1975 after the changes. And I'll point out a couple of issues. The differences you can see in the 1975 passage I've put in italics. For example, the lack of nasality, tand becomes thund, or the geg future, come pa, becomes dotosho, the standard and Tosk future. And again, the geg way of lack of rhoticism changes. At the bottom, we have trimni becomes trimari. It was not until the 1980s, as Yugoslavia began to disintegrate, that political actors in Serbia began to appreciate the importance of what we've been talking about. The notorious draft memorandum of the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1985 singled out the importance of language in creating an Albanian identity in Kosovo. The draft memorandum was in turn a clear inspiration for the constitutional amendments proposed by Serbia in 1988, which had the effect of relegating the Albanian language, and indeed the Latin script, to second-class status in Kosovo. This, in turn, gave rise to Kosovo-Albanian intellectuals mounting a spirited defense of the status of Standard Albanian as a national symbol, something which motivates many Kosovo-Albanian linguists today. However, the promise and enthusiasm of those days generated huge linguistic uncertainty. On the one hand, there was a feeling that some people went to excess to fulfill the strictures of the standard. On the other, experiences in the school system showed that Standard Albanian was not taking root as hoped or expected. The collapse of communism in Albania brought with it a demand in the north of the country for redress for what the region had suffered under communism, including the suppression of its literary language. In Kosovo, with the end of the 98-99 war, demands began to be heard for revisiting or even abandoning the settlement in Pristina of 1968, which was ratified in Tirana in 1972. Today, at least among intellectuals, the consensus epitomized by Ali Hadri has broken down. To give you an example of the linguistic uncertainty in Europe, in Kosovo, at least among ordinary people, here are 4 signs for rent, 4 photographs which I took in the same part of Pristina on the same day, within a few streets of each other. Jepet Mechera is the standard way of saying for rent. Ipet Mechera is the way it's said in Pristina. And as you can see, here are 4 different ways of spelling this. And there I would like to say I'm very happy to talk more about issues as they are to at the current point, but perhaps that would be best done in the debate, in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Justin. And we'll open the floor to Q&A, questions and answers.
Thank you, Justin. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating.
Do you have a question, Michael?
Oh, not a question so much as an observation. The 4 for rent signs taken in Pristina, I think you said?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, well, it reminds me, my grandmother was a native Gaelic speaker born in the 1880s, and she could converse quite happily with people although she was from the Western Isles, from the Isle of Lewis, she could converse quite happily with people from County Cork in Ireland. But of course, she had a lot of trouble with vocabulary, because a lot of the words they use, the Irish version of Gaelic has 20 times more words for a particular thing than the Scottish version of Gaelic. So you had to think a bit to make sure you were talking about the same thing. And this is what it looks like. I mean, it's fascinating.
If I may, Justin, can I obviously, I'm caught up in the present day of all of this. So the history is fascinating. I mean, it really, really very interesting in terms of both, as you say, the political, social, cultural relevance of all this. And I can imagine in the 40s, 50s and 60s, how for the Kosovo Albanian community, standard Albanian was really a way of protecting their own ethnic nationalism. But today, we're almost past that. You know, Kosovo has been a state now, or independence, you know, in 2008. And in some ways, has there kind of been a movement back towards Geger here in Kosovo as that statement of ethnic nationalism? Or do you think that process of standard Albanian continues?
That's an absolutely fascinating question. Thank you very much for it. It's one that divides Kosovo intellectuals hugely. If you go, say, to the Albanological Institute, you will find that probably most of the linguistics are passionate defenders of the standard. They certainly, as far as it being a written language, if anything is in writing, it needs to be in the standard. It is a symbol of the union of all Albanians, and it also explicitly linked to the desire for political unity of all Albanians. Also, it's seen, and they will also link that to defense of Albanian against the encroachment of foreign vocabulary. And it's interesting that you say, Albania has been an independent state, particularly the Serb and Montenegrin threat of that being the default culture of daily life in Yugoslavia is no longer there. But a number of people that take such a position have, since 1999, singled out English, particularly during the UN mandate and the UNMIC, during the UNMIC and the ULEX mandates, as being a particular danger, casting it in the role of the colonial oppressor, if you like, with the waves of English words coming into the language. However, that is by no means a universal position. There are also many that would view, that do view it as necessary to have some sort of radical appraisal. There are some that want to see Geg revived for a kind of Kosovo identity. But I would say that they're probably a rather small number. Much more is particularly by generation, is younger intellectuals who say there needs to be some sort of reappraisal, some sort of putting in more elements of Geg, particularly the infinitive, for whatever reason, into the language, and maybe, for example, the shortened participle of Geg. There are other linguists who simply say languages develop as they develop, and we shouldn't be being prescriptive, but looking at the language and saying, if it changes in a certain way, then that's the way it has to go. And they would point, for example, to the domination, for example, of in Albania, including in Tosk areas, of rap music, for example, by Geg speakers, and showing the influence that that has, and saying that whether we like it or not, there will eventually be some direction pulled towards Geg, not least as the dialect of the majority. So I would say that there are, as I said, these three camps: the diehard pro-standard, the politically pro-Geg, and those that say what will come will come.
Thank you. That's, as we could continue discussing this for a long time, but I particularly like the rap issue, because I think Geg is a lot better for rap. And if Sam Pace is still with us, he, I'm sure, could tell us much more about it, as he's a big fan of Albanian rap. But I mean, it is fascinating, and not a debate, obviously, that we get caught up in very often. But thank you very much for this evening. Super. Really.
It's a pleasure.
Great.
I think we've got a question from Xem Alpion. I think you're typing it. Maybe you could say it.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for joining you late. Congratulations, Justin. A fascinating talk. And quite a lot to learn from, although I'm Albanian. A number of issues that you raised were completely new to me, especially in terms of what you said with regards to Macedonia and events in Yugoslavia, particularly after the Second World War up until the 60s. You said something about the term Shqiptar or Skiptar, and I understand that even nowadays, Albanians in Kosovo are all what I've read from the media is that the Serbs, some Serbs, use the term as a derogatory term to address to Albanians. Do you know when this started? Because all Albanians call themselves Shqiptar, and the root of the word is Shqiponia. This has always been the case, at least for centuries. So irrespective of where Albanians ended up living after the events in the start of the 20th century, they always have identified themselves as Shqiptar, whether it's Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, you name it. Where is this? I mean, where did it start that the word Shqiptar is used as a derogatory term?
The word originally came from the communists before the war in the Second World War in Serbia. Albanians often were referred to as Arnauti.
Yeah.
After the war, and certainly during the war and afterwards, particularly the partisans referred to them as Shqiptari, as a way of distinguishing Albanians within Yugoslavia to those in Albania. it's become derogatory largely because of the one is the perception of Albanians within Yugoslavia, which I referred to, is that this was, if you like, an imposed identity on them which they rejected. And those that maintained, that kept calling them Shqiptari, at that point, it really becomes something derogatory. And while the official media stopped using it, as I said, in the 1960s, this came back in the 1980s with a vengeance from Serbian and Montenegrin and Macedonian media. And it's really at that point that it begins to have an almost universally derogatory feel towards it. I certainly Albanac for Albanian is the acceptable term in Serbian now. Does that help you answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering if there is anything, a hidden agenda behind the term Shqiptari to argue that Albanians are latecomers. Do you think there is any tendency in there to use this kind of terms for the purpose of highlighting what became one of the aims of Serbian propaganda from the 19th century onwards?
I haven't heard anything within that respect, rather more about where the origins of the Albanian language lie, which Serbian scholars often say comes from Thracian rather than Illyrian.
Right, yeah. No, that's a long debate. Thank you very much.
Do we have more questions?
Sarah, I think you've got your hand up, so we'll
yes, I was uncertain that was clear, but yeah, thank you. I'm Sarah Schneider-Alia. I'm a social scientist in Oxford. Thanks so much for your talk. I have two questions, actually. One is, so I'm more focused on Albania. I don't know as much about Kosovo. So it was really interesting to hear about language from that perspective. Thinking about this development of the very political development of Tusk becoming the standard, or more dominantly Tusk influencing the standard Albanian, is that power differential between the South and the North potentially being carried forward into modern day Albania on an intellectual level? Because when I'm in Albania, I can see that people from the South, they make fun of people from the North for their dialect. Even in Tirana, you can see that locals of Tirana are sometimes made fun of because of their dialect and so on. And yeah, I'm just wondering whether you observe anything of that kind. And then my second question was, how do you think is modern day Kosovar Albanian influencing Albania's Albanian? And in what way? I'm thinking here of maybe more Slavic vocabulary or more Turkic in vocabulary because of the stronger Muslim links.
Mm.
Also more foreign words because Yugoslavia was much more open.
Yeah. I certainly, as far as the first question is concerned, certainly there has been historically a concentration of, certainly because that's where most of the communist leaders came from, that Toskaria was the culturally dominant area of the country. It's the one who had the standard language, and where those that brought up their children in the standard language, and it tends to reflect back on Toskaria. It must also be said, because the division between the two main political parties in Albania also is not that different from the Geg-Tusk divide. That has also got an element to it. Action breeds reaction. You have the same sort of perhaps contempt that you have in among tasks, who are of course perfectly happy with the standard as the way it is. Very few people, when polled, want any sort of change whatever. And you have a complete opposite reaction in somewhere like Geger, where it's very much a matter of Geger revival, though perhaps for local reasons rather than the reasons I referred to in Kosovo. As to the second question, certainly as far as Turkish-based language, I think in some ways that this is perhaps being more accepted, that there are very many Turkicisms that have survived and which perhaps were not acknowledged. A lot of the dictionary produced by the Academy of Sciences rigorously removed a lot of Turkish words. But if you go to ordinary places within Albania, they still exist. Whether there is any influence from Kosovo or Macedonia I would have no idea about that. As far as Serbian words or German words, again, I would have thought that this is, I don't know, but I would have thought that this is rather unlikely. To point out as to where foreign influence comes from, there was not so long ago a linguistic conference in Albania entitled "Is Italian a Foreign Language?"
That's very interesting. Thank you.
We've got a few more questions. I'll just read out the order. So it's John Watkins, Elizabeth Gowing, Samuel Pace, and then we've got Noel Malcolm, and Jamie Rees. So should we take yours, John? If you want me to read it out, or do you want to say it yourself? Where are you? Okay, I'll read it out. So he asks, how does Geger spoken in northern Albania compared with Albanian Geg as spoken in Kosovo? I'd always thought the two were pretty much identical.
There are two main dialects, Northeastern Geg and Northwestern Geg. Northeastern Geg is the sort that you found spoken in Kosovo, and Northwestern Geg is quite different, or quite reasonably different, as that is what you will find. Basically, that's what Geg revivalists in Shkodra write in. And one should also remember that, as I've referred to earlier, these are not the only parts of the former Yugoslavia that were Albanian speaking, and certainly Macedonia has its own form of Geg as well.
And Elizabeth, do you want to say your question? Whoop, I think actually I can't see her anymore on here. So we might just, I think, I'm not sure it's a question, it was more of a statement. She says, my understanding is the difference between Shqiptar and Shqiptar to be derogatory, even though Serbian does have a sh pattern in the language. I think maybe she's saying that only one of those two forms was derogatory. I don't
Yes,
know
it's definitely the Shqiptar form, the one without the sh sound.
Mm-hmm. So I've never heard of Serbs though use Shqiptar with a ch. I've
Me
never
neither.
heard what would be considered derogatory version of it, and still used today, I'd add.
Oh, indeed.
Oh yes, she said she has to leave. Jamie has asked, thanks for the fascinating talk, Justin. Love the examples of signs in modern day Kosovo. How do contemporary Kosovars feel about the flexibility or fluidity in their written Albanian? I gather, yeah.
There, again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. It's the distinction between if you like, the Institute of Albanology Linguists and other people those people who are of a rather more nationalist or traditionally nationalist bent of mind, and particularly of the older generation, produce a very large number of articles in learned journals and the press expressing horror at any sort of fluidity, any sort of deviation from the standards, in particular in our the written language. So, I mean, their view is that you should write in the same language, whether you are writing a letter to the president or a text message to your friend. On the other hand, there are those that say there are those who are much more open, at least to local influence, and those who, as I said before, are rather more descriptive linguists than prescriptive, and are just interested in how the language changes, rather than saying, no, this is a wrong way of doing it. Does that help?
I think it does. I'm not Jamie. But so if Samuel Pace, I think you've had your hand up for a while. So to reward you for that and for using the hand symbol. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'd just like to thank Dr. Elliott for a fascinating talk. These are subjects which I've been interested in for some time, and you crystallized and really put under the microscope a number of points which I found incredibly helpful. I've got a sort of long association with Albania, particularly and Albanians, and I've spent a number of years working in both Albania and Kosovo, both, well, mainly inside the Foreign Office and the embassies, but also outside as well. And I'm now sort of gravitated towards an Albania and Kosovo focused job in King Charles Street, which I'm delighted about. I think when I arrived in Kosovo, at the beginning of my posting there in 2017, I quickly realized that I'd made a number of assumptions about kind of Kosovan Albanian culture and language and so on, which were very quickly challenged. And I had a period of kind of culture shock almost, having learnt Albanian to quite a high level, and being married to an Albanian from Albania as well, who was as unfamiliar and as surprised by some of these phenomena as I was when we got there. So yes, many of the things that you've described have a kind of a familiarity. I think the question of young Albanians, I'm going to come to my question in a second. I met and worked with quite a lot of young Albanians during my time there. And I think in Kosovo, Kosovo is a very young country. So there are a large number now of young adults who were born or became aware of these sort of issues a long time after the end of the war in 1999. And I think I would characterize their sort of approach to this flexibility as incredibly flexible and incredibly pragmatic. And there are many different reasons for that, including obviously interruptions and problems with the education system at various key points, particularly before, during, and after the war. The point about the word Shqiptar is also, this is obviously something that's come up in kind of regional politics recently. I don't pretend to understand it, and I think your explanation is very helpful. My understanding is that it's a specific slur used by elements of Serbian politics or media, specifically against Albanians in the former Yugoslavia, rather than Albanians in Albania. And I think you explained very well the context for that. But at the time, one of the last flare-ups, it was explained to us that it was sort of one of the worst kind of racial epithets that could be used in within the sort of ethnic groups of the Balkans. So my question is, so one of the sort of prisms that I've seen some of these issues through having experienced it in both countries, Albania and Kosovo, is the Catholic Church, and the liturgy of the Catholic Church in both countries, it's the same liturgy, and it retains a very sort of Gegerish centered vocabulary, style, rhythm. It preserves, I think, this sort of early sense of literary Albanian, not in the 20th century sense of the word. So I just wondered if you had any reflections on the role of the Catholic Church, particularly because of the sort of almost extinction of the church in Albania during communism, and the fact that some of its repopulation after communism came from Kosovo or the Kosovan diaspora, and Catholic priests and intellectuals and so on. And then my final point / question was about, I think people were commenting on this shift of the center of gravity. That's how I'm characterizing it. So your map, as you showed at the beginning, it's very clear that Geger is the kind of predominant dialect in its various forms of subdialects. And now that all the iron curtains and walls and so on of the past have fallen, what unites young people is, as it is in most of the rest of the world, the internet, social media, television channels, which are available to everybody through different platforms in all of the countries. So I think somebody asked, will this happen? I think my perspective is that it's already happening, and it's happened to a great degree. But I just wondered if you had any reflections on that, and how the historical context is obviously very interesting, but for these young Kosovans, for instance, that I mentioned, they learn a lot more about their language and culture from Facebook and television programs and so on than they do from elsewhere. Thank you. Sorry, that was a long question.
No, not at all. I mean, thank you. I mean, that's an absolutely fascinating reflection, and on what I said, so much of this, you're right, depends on the age of the person you're talking to, and the as I've found that much of perhaps the biggest indicator of somebody's attitude towards this is whether they finished, they were at least in primary education by the time of the linguistic consultation. Those older than that, particularly those that finished secondary education by then, are very much in favor of the standard and lived through the time of huge enthusiasm for the standard in the 70s and early 80s. Those younger than that, and particularly the younger that you go, are very much more open to all sorts of influences, including local influences. And you're absolutely right. The written language isn't as many linguists would like it to be, or would even imagine it to be. The language is much closer to the language of the street. That, as you say, has perhaps something to do with the education system, but it's also that it's the language of Kosovo is quite far removed from the standard. And however, it should be said that so far politically, neither one side or the other has been influential enough to make this a political issue, or to make language a political issue. People are, certainly on political life, seem to be happy with things as the way, to let the current situation continue, which certainly both sides of people interested in the language debate are unhappy with, for their own reasons. As far as the influence of the Catholic Church, yes, I mean, I think that this also, the influence of the Catholic Church, I think particularly has to be looked at through the prism of Shkodra, the prism of the Catholic Church in the diaspora, and the revival of, for example, the periodical Hilidritus, which was not only, which was a major intellectual magazine of the 1930s, which was revived in the 1980s and has been a standard bearer for in the 1990s and onwards for those who want to see a revision of the standard language more towards Geg. It is interesting that I asked a question at our last meeting about the translation of the Bible by the Catholic Dominical Katsori, a Montenegrin priest, into Albanian. He translated it into the standard language, basically so it would be used as widely as possible, used within service and so on, but even but on the other hand, he has said the standard language got rid of our Geg infinitive, and this was one of the greatest tragedies that happened. I don't know how to what extent that answers your question.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you very much.
We've got two more. We've got a question from Noel. You've not written it, so you might have to say it. And then I think it's Phil after that. And I think, Stephen, unless you want to drum up any more questions, that's probably it for the evening. So
yes, I would like to say some words after the end of the questions. If you...
Okay, perfect. So can we have your question, Noel?
Yes, thanks. Sorry, just trying to switch the camera. Sorry, I think. Guessing you're trying to end by 1:30, so I'll be as brief.
No, we don't have a cut-off, but
okay. Well,
have...
anyway, thank you, Justin, so much. That was a marvelous talk and very informative and wonderfully clear. I'm interested in the sort of political dimension of this. The Pristina linguistic consultation is in the spring of '68, and before the end of the year, there are real shockwaves from demonstrations, not large ones, but they're still shocking. People in the streets of Pristina saying, "Long live Enver Hoxha," and "Stop treating us like a colony," and so on. Mm. Well, it's true, rank dead sort of internal intelligence apparatus is perhaps weakened by that, but they certainly were in a position to tell that there was a possible political dimension to adopting Tirana-devised Albanian, and to understand the significance of that to Albanian intellectuals. I'm guessing you've answered that point thoroughly enough by saying, well, basically, even if Belgrade had wanted to impose some sort of different version of Albanian, they just couldn't, it was too late by then. You couldn't do such a thing. The educated class and these Albanian intellectuals wouldn't have gone with it, and you just couldn't, it wasn't practical. But scroll back to 1948, and this is what interests me. You have a pretty blank slate for Belgrade to do what it wants there. As you said, there's high illiteracy in the Albanian population in Kosovo. You've got a recently victorious communist army and state. They could have manufactured a different version of Albanian specifically to make it different. And I'm thinking particularly after 48 itself, after the split, when an iron curtain comes down on the Albanian-Kosovar border. So why didn't they? And you gave the counter example of Macedonia. Fine. I mean, to be fair, one should say that there was a serious Macedonian intellectual movement saying it was a proper language, and people publishing books saying that from the 1890s onwards. And so something slightly different happening there. But the main point you emphasized was this doctrine about the constituent people of a republic as opposed to a nationality. And Macedonia had that status. The Albanians of Kosovo were a mere nationality. But still I'm puzzled. I really am puzzled. And the analogy I would give would be Moldova in the Soviet Union, where a big effort was made to turn the local Romanian dialect into a different language, which included, absurdly, forcing everyone to write it in Cyrillic. Now, that's pretty extreme, but it happened. And power politics surely trumps other considerations, including this sort of neat constitutional principle about the difference between a nation and a nationality. So my question is, was there really no sign ever of people in Belgrade thinking along those lines? I mean, I've never seen it, and it puzzled me when I was sort of working on that period of Kosovar history. But isn't there something rather strange about them never trying that, particularly, you know, just after 48? It could still have been done, I think.
Yes.
And it might have tapped into local linguistic nationalism in Kosovo that was later unviable, but could have been viable then.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, that I think is what I was driving at in making those comparisons with Macedonia, is that these are the things that could have been done with Albanian at the time. It's just they weren't. I mean, there were, I believe, some attempts in those very early days by the Yugoslav authorities to set up some form of, I don't think they were perhaps particularly as concerned with Yugoslavs within Albania, but as an alternative pole of Albanian culture, by opening, for example, the first incarnation of the Albanological Institute in 1953, of developing some forms of local Albanian language, periodicals, if not press, and by opening a regional library. All of these, however, get shut down in the 1950s, around the time of there is an argument within the Kosovo party about the place of folklore and what it is that Albanian intellectuals are doing about that at the time, and a number of members of the Albanian party, of the Communist Party, Albanian members of the Kosovo Communist Party are, shall we say, put out to grass at that point, at least at that time. So I think there might be example of some form of, there is also, of course, the Yugoslav encouragement of refugees from Albania. But I feel that it's really much about talking about this is a means of propaganda against what the Albanians are doing, of saying that it doesn't really have all that much impact on Kosovo itself. And certainly in linguistic terms, I have seen absolutely nothing that suggests that they were really at all interested in what it was, other than in terms of the status of the language. In terms of what the language actually looks like, I see no evidence at all.
Right, I think, Phil, this is the last question. Phil?
You're muted, Phil.
Is he?
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, Justin.
Hello, Phil.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello. I'm speaking as a son of a Geger speaker, talented writer and journalist Anton Logoretsi, born in Shkodra in 1910. So he was an Ottoman subject at birth. head of the Albanian section of BBC. And I don't really have a question, but I would like to thank you very much, Justin. That's a fascinating talk. And I know that my father would have been very interested in your research and what you talked about tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'd like to wish you the very best of luck for your new job in America. Can I also say to everybody, it's lovely to, at Justin's very interesting talk, seen some new faces participating in this Zoom, in this fascinating event. And I'd like to say also two things. First of all, I'm finally learning Albanian, Justin, at long last. My father never wanted to teach us because having to work at it all day, he was fed up by the evening. But I'm finally learning it with a wonderful teacher who's listening to the talk now, so I don't want to embarrass her, but I am finally learning it and very much enjoying it. And then secondly, with my treasurer of the Anglo-Albanian Association hat on, for the people who are listening to this evening, we'd be very grateful and love it if you would join the Anglo-Albanian Association via our website. So thank you again, Justin. Faleminderit shumë, faleminderit shumë.
Nderqosh.
So, Arber, is it time?
I think it is. I think we're...
Right, well, firstly, before I say thank you to those who've been involved this evening, and it's been a very good evening, I just want to have this opportunity, take this opportunity to tell you that our next event is on the 9th of June at 5:30. It's a talk on the Albanian economy by the former Nash Fellow at CEAS, Dr. Luca Uberti, who is probably known to quite a number of you. And then on the 15th of July, we have a talk on forestry in Albania by Roland Leschi of the PPNEA. That's at 6 o'clock on the 15th of July. And then we are scheduling our AGM, Annual General Meeting, for the 29th of September. So I would also echo what Phil has just said. Non-members who are with us here this evening are very welcome, but they'd be even more welcome when they become members. So we hope you will take the opportunity to join if you want to do so. And as Phil said, go to the website, and that's angloalbanian@gmail.com. You can communicate with us to that address and take it from there. So now I want to thank Justin, Dr. Justin Elliott. Justin, that was a fascinating evening, and we really have gone very deep into this subject, which is, I think, for many of us, a new subject in the sense that we know about, Geger and Tosk exist, but we've never sort of had our hand held and been led into the labyrinth of what the detail actually involves, and also the political implications as well. So it's been a fascinating evening. And also, we do hope you'll keep in touch with us from California, where, of course, you can Zoom to us surely sometime during your 3 years there, or however long you're staying. So we do want to keep in touch with you. So thank you also to Arber for managing the Zoom this evening from our new web provider, which is seems to be functioning perfectly well, which is a great relief. And also thank you to our Honourable Secretary, Pat Swire. And also, finally, to all of you in the audience who have contributed to what I think has been an enjoyable evening of discussion. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Faleminderit shumë. Miru Pashin. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Miru Pafshim.